Yeah. We'd said in the opening, you're chairperson of Christians of Christians in Caring Professions. Can you tell us a little bit about that? How that organisation came about and what they say? I found a very interesting statement about yourselves on in your blog on the website, which when you're talking about, I'd love. You talk about exercising a prophetic role in present day society, and I thought, wow, I like that. But and I know it does explain it a little bit further on. But when you're talking about, can you explain a little bit about that as well?
Well, Christians in Caring Professions used to be called Caring Professions Seminars, and it came about in the long time ago in the 70s and 80s with Reverend Harper and bringing seminars together, bringing medical professions and doctors together to talk about the interrelation between faith and healing, if you like. Right. And then CICP developed, and it used to be called Christian Caring Professions Concerned, and then became Christians in Caring Professions. And this was a group of GPs and other nurses, social workers, physiotherapists, all other professions who wanted to bring their faith and work together. How can I witness for Jesus in my place of work without proselytizing, without forcing the gospel of people? How can I be effective as Christians? And it started off in the heady days of the 80s when the charismatic churches were blossoming and everybody believed they could walk on water and that Christians were going to take over the world. And as Christians, it was to encourage us together to stand for Christian medicine, really. And many Christian practices started up all over the country. Doctors started new practices where they wanted to bring their faith and work together. Mm-hmm. And that's what happened. I started a practice in Hedge End, Southampton, with that same view, related to the local church, where we saw this as a mechanism for the church to do some social care and helping projects within Hedge End. Then this goes on today. The practice now grown to 7 doctors, and the church has grown very large to 800 members. But it wasn't like that in the 80s when I started. I started with no patients in the front room, right. and the church was a handful of people.
Right. And so Christians in Caring Profession support these people. Do doctors that become members of the group and there's support there and help for them? How does that work?
But by and large, actually, it's quite interesting because we ran loads of seminars and training things in the 80s and early 90s, and this was to encourage people how to bring their faith and medicine together. And we had loads of wonderful examples. In the practice we ran a Christian counselling service. We used to have Christian self-help books that people could use. And also we could have a prayer clinic for people who wanted to sign up for it. It by no means was anyway preaching at people. This was another option that people could have to seek help from a Christian point of view. Our practice booklet had that we are a Christian practice, and the way we practice medicine is based on the teachings of Jesus and on how he cared for the sick. Other people did other things in developing, bringing their faith together. I'll tell you an interesting story about an anaesthetist who was a member of the CRCP and asked, how can I share my faith with people as an anaesthetist? How can I see God working in the within the anaesthetics? And God told him, all I want you to do is whilst you're there asleep and you're messing around with the gases and checking them and all the rest of it, just pray that I would speak to them by the Holy Spirit in a dream whilst they're asleep. And that's what he did. And then afterwards, he would simply say, whilst you're asleep, did you have any dreams whilst you're on earth? And then they would say, yes. Why did you say that? And because I met God, or my life flashed before me, or something very dramatic. And then he said, well, actually, I was a Christian. I was praying that God would speak to you whilst you're asleep. That's all he did. And then encouraged them to go off to, obviously to seek further help if they're required. Yeah. So God can use lots of different ways to, for professions to actively bring their faith to work. Because obviously we can't proselytize vulnerable adults, can't push them into things. And that's not what Jesus did either. He ministered to people who were hungry.
Because, yeah, I mean, many people who are sick, as you say, are very vulnerable at that point in time, and therefore we do have to really care for them, don't we? And but you've used this word holistic, and presumably, and you explain that a bit more to our viewers, you're talking about not just the spiritual, you're talking about the emotional, you're talking about the physical. How do you do that in the situation? As you say, you've got GPs, you've got nurses on wards, you've got nurses in critical. How can they be, as a Christian, be holistic to their patients?
Well, of course, they sometimes can't themselves personally because they haven't practically got it. It's about networking and knowing someone who can, and if they need a visitor or someone, if they're lonely or they need practical support, knowing an organisation or a Christian organisation in your area perhaps who may be able to help them. And this is how you can encourage people to be more holistic in this.
Right.
But many people, I mean, as a doctor, it's not just about their practical physical needs. You know, most people, every physical need has an emotional and spiritual element to it.
Right.
And so you've got to be aware of that.
As churches, as most churches stand for reaching out to spiritual needs, I would assume from what you've just said there that maybe as Christians we need to see beyond that, especially today, maybe when we're living in a society where a lot of family life has broken down, and there may be a lot of isolated people and a lot of people that don't have the family support, etc. Is there a need for us as Christians to see this ministry as being far more holistic than it's ever been before?
I would agree with that. The church has to become a much more actively involved in the social care and practical needs. The gospel is not just about meeting people's spiritual needs, praying for them and then letting them go home and to a place where the housing is inadequate or where there's no social support or where the kids are running riot. The church has to try and engage much more actively in meeting the whole person's needs. That's what Jesus did. And I think it's very difficult for churches, though, with, you know, if you're a small church with this, it's easier in a large church. But if we don't do that, we're not actually fulfilling the gospel. The gospel isn't just about preaching to people. It's about caring for the whole person. There are many, obviously, non-Christian groups that seek to do this. Many good charities seek to do it. We don't have the monopoly of care. But as Christians, we should be offering excellent care. Years ago, of course, before we had the welfare state, social services, etc., the church was the main source for people to receive support and help, both practically, emotionally and spiritually. And I'd like to see it go back. There are a number of initiatives which are happening. Of course, there's now the parish nurse idea has come along, you may have heard of, where they're looking for professionals for churches actually to take on board professionals who will perhaps do voluntary work as extra on top of their normal duties, but they would be recognised and interrelate with the other professionals who are caring. There are obviously groups of Christians who've set about to set up Christian alternatives, whether they're care homes or for elderly people or learning disabilities, which I've been involved in, or setting up drug rehabilitation units and support organisations, and certainly I think churches need to be much more engaged in working with the marginalised, the poor and needy in our area, the elderly, the vulnerable, those that normally most people wouldn't want to get involved in.